Thanks everybody for coming. I'm super excited to be here and to share with you a little bit about the type of research I do, and in particular this project on invasive Northern Pike. I know the Gunn Institute is really diverse, and so I'm going to start out with just a little bit of basic information on this fish. Northern pike are broadly distributed across the Northern Hemisphere. You can see this on the map on the screen. And they are top predators, consuming prey up to 75% of their body size. And this is literally anything they can fit in their mouth, they will eat. And because of this really high predatory drive, even young fish have high predation rates and can have high predatory impacts. Now, Northern pike, within North America, Northern pike are native to portions of the Midwest into Canada and also Alaska, so that's shown in yellow on this map. And they have been broadly introduced outside of their native range as a popular sport fish, and that you're seeing on this screen in red and pink. Now, where they've been introduced outside this native range, they cause a lot of declines in native fish communities. And so there's this really growing concern over the impacts that these invasive Northern pike can have on native fisheries, particularly fish that are either culturally relevant and or economically relevant. Now today I'm going to focus on the invasion of Northern pike in the Columbia River Basin, and that's I'm showing you that here on the map. And this is where Northern pike have been a really hot topic for Native American tribes, as well as state fish and wildlife agencies, as well as policymakers, because of the potential impacts that these invasive pike can have on native species. And we have a lot of native species in the Columbia River Basin, but there are some species that receive quite a lot of attention and are the source of a lot of this concern. So in particular, here I'm showing you salmon as well as steelhead trout that are native to this area. And these fish are really valued because they support a multi-million-dollar regional economy. So policymakers and state fish and wildlife agencies are really focused on protecting these species. Now, there's another species I want to add to this list that I feel is relevant to this conversation. And for those of you who were just at the Build seminar, you maybe heard me talk a little bit about lamprey. Pacific lamprey in particular are another species that I'm adding to this list. If you don't know about them, I would be happy to talk your ear off after. But they are an ancient lineage of jawless fish. And along with these salmon, Pacific lamprey, all of the species that I'm showing you here are either listed under the Endangered Species Act or have been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So they are also a species of conservation concern. Now, another thing that all of these fish have in common is that they have an anadromous life cycle. Anadromous means that these fish are born in freshwater, and they spend a portion of their life migrating out to oceans where they grow really large and they eat a whole bunch, and then they return to freshwater as adults to spawn. And when they return to spawn, they serve as a really important source of nutrients for both ecosystems and people in those freshwaters where they're spawned, because they're bringing all these nutrients from the oceans back that help sustain those ecosystems and people. And so it's not surprising that all of these anadromous fish are also culturally significant to Indigenous peoples of the Columbia River Basin. And so protecting these fish from negative effects of invasive species is a really high priority, not only for those state agencies and policymakers that care about the economic value, mostly of salmon, but also because Indigenous tribes really value these species. And I just wanted to point out some of the things here on this screen include a really cool way that lamprey are filleted for preservation. That's a kind of a traditional method of preserving lamprey to eat later, but the Nez Perce seasonal round can show you how dependent Native Americans are on different organisms throughout different times of the year. And so all of these species are playing a role in that sort of cultural relevance and tying tribes to their homelands overall. Okay, so returning to our map, this black box shows the study area that I'm going to focus on today. And let's zoom into this study area. Okay, so I'm showing you here that gray line is the boundary of the Columbia River Basin. That's the eastern boundary. It's the headwaters of the Columbia River Basin. And I also want to mention there are a lot of other, there are a lot of streams and rivers on this map that I'm not showing you. I'm only showing you those that are relevant to sort of this study area and this study that I'm sharing with you today. These arrows are showing you the direction of flow of water. So it's generally moving from right to left across the stream or screen from east to west. And now I'm showing you these pink areas are all Indian reservations in this area. And I'm only showing you the names of the Indian reservations for whom Northern Pike, invasive Northern Pike are a really big problem. So those reservations that are working actively here to deal with this Northern Pike invasion. Now it's worth mentioning that typically state fish and game agencies manage fish and wildlife. However, there are a few exceptions, and this includes on Indian reservations where tribes, as sovereign nations, have the rights to manage fish and wildlife on reservations. And then there are also a number of instances through treaties that have allowed tribes to retain rights to manage natural resources off reservations. Okay, finally, all of these little crosses are dams that block upstream passage of fish. So fish can move downstream throughout this system, but they have a lot of trouble moving upstream. And in particular, I want to point out these two dams, Chief Joseph Dam and Grand Coulee Dam. Grand Coulee Dam, the relevance of that will become a little more apparent in a few more slides as I talk about the Northern Pike invasion, but in particular, Chief Joseph Dam. The streams downstream of the dams downstream of Chief Joseph Dam have been retrofitted to allow salmon to pass upstream. Chief Joseph Dam, however, does not have that. And so what I'm showing you on this map is areas where anadromous fish, so all of those salmon and lamprey and the steelhead that I was talking about have been extirpated from this orange region here. So they were historically present there prior to dams being put on the landscape, and the Chief Joseph Dam blocks upstream passage. And then all of the other dams upstream of Chief Joseph also do not have that ability to allow fish to move upstream. All right, so this has been also, and I mentioned this, but it's important to note it's been a primary cause of decline of those anadromous species throughout this area. Okay, so returning to our study area, I'm going to tell you now about the history of Northern Pike in this area. There's not a lot of information known on how Northern Pike have spread throughout this area for a number of reasons. One, in the last century, 100 years ago, 70 years ago, we had a different approach to fish and wildlife management, and we tend to move fish around based just on public interest. And so the distribution of Northern Pike in this area is a combination of illegal introductions, but it could also include instances in which fish were moved assisted by state fish and wildlife agencies, but it was just poorly documented because we weren't keeping really tight records on that sort of thing. And it could also include instances in which pike just spread on their own volition through just invasive species expansion. So the first known occurrence of Northern Pike in the Columbia River Basin, in this area, came from a translocation that we believe was from by a private citizen, and it actually came from a native population. This is interesting. There is a native population right on the other side of the Rocky Mountain Divide, outside the Columbia River Basin, translocated by a private citizen into a reservoir on the Flathead Indian Reservation in the 1950s. And so there's a bit of anecdote around this. The citation for this is an article in a newspaper in like the early 2000s that's citing a fish manager that was very old. So, there's not documentation on this. Within about 10 to 20 years, we saw pike expand into the Flathead River system, as well as the Bitterroot River system. And then pike expanded downstream throughout the Clark Fork River into the 1970s. At this time, there was what we believe a translocation into the Coeur d'Alene River Basin in the mid-1970s, and then expansion downstream into the Upper Spokane River by the end of the 1970s. We then had pike show up in what we believe was another translocation in the Clearwater River Basin in the 1980s, which then spread downstream into the Blackfoot River in the 1990s. Okay, so By the end of the 1990s, this was sort of our known distribution of northern pike in this study area. And this kind of held steady for a while until 2004 when pike showed up in the Pend Oreille River. And remember, the Kalispel tribe has a reservation that's very tiny, but is located right along the base of that river. And so pretty quickly, knowing the impacts that invasive northern pike could have, the tribe began a very heavy suppression effort as soon as they found them. But pike, when they found these pike, they're very fast growing, the population expanded very quickly. They were able, over the course of the next 8 years, to reduce the density of northern pike by 90%, but they weren't able to do it quickly enough, and pike continued to spread downstream into the mainstem Columbia River Basin, and they showed up downstream in British Columbia. Now, another thing that's interesting to note is that 2009 is also when pike showed up in Lake Pend Oreille. Now, for decades, anglers have anecdotally reported catching northern pike in Lake Pend Oreille. However, it was not until 2009, which is 5 years after they showed up in the Pend Oreille River downstream, it wasn't until 2009 that Idaho Fish and Game actually surveyed pike in their annual survey efforts. So, we think prior to that point, northern pike, if they were present, it was incidental. They weren't reaching high enough densities to be detected with the regular survey efforts. Okay, so then sadly, pike continued to spread downstream into eastern Washington. By 2011, they reached Lake Roosevelt. Lake Roosevelt is a reservoir within the mainstem Columbia River, and what forms that reservoir is the Grand Coulee Dam. And that I pointed it out before, I'm going to point it out again, but it's this cross right here, halfway down the Colville Reservation. And pike continued to spread downstream. By 2018, they had reached sort of the lower end of that reservoir right up against Grand Coulee Dam. So there's Grand Coulee Dam, there's the Colville Reservation, and the Colville tribe, actually all of the tribes in this region, as well as the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and policymakers, were really concerned because if pike expanded downstream beyond Grand Coulee Dam, they were very close to approaching the zone of anadromede, or critical habitat for trout and salmon in the Methow and the Okanagan rivers. And remember from what I explained earlier, the one dam downstream of Grand Coulee is Chief Joseph Dam. Everything downstream of that, anadromous fish are able to get to those areas. And so if northern pike expanded downstream there, the fear is that they would predate all of these threatened and endangered stocks of fish, and we would lose those species that are already imperiled. So the Colville tribe has rights to manage fish in Lake Roosevelt, and they began a suppression effort for northern pike in that area. But we had some questions we wanted to answer to understand how those efforts could be most effective, because one thing that tribes in particular really struggle with is having well-funded natural resource agencies. Tribes are routinely underfunded, and so we wanted to be as efficient as possible in the efforts that they were able to put out there. And we know from the efforts that the Kalispel tribe performed upstream that if they were able to put enough effort out there, they could be successful at reducing those pike densities, right? However, with those limited resources, we wanted to make sure we were going to be as efficient as possible and had a couple information needs that we needed to address. This, by the way, is a northern pike that was captured in Lake Roosevelt, and it's really huge, and you can imagine it's going to eat anything it can fit in its mouth. And so I'm not kidding you, they also will eat ducklings and small birds. But any fish smaller than that is easily going to be caught. So the first information need we wanted to address was to get fine scale information to monitor the invasion edge, the leading edge of that invasion, and then also be ready to detect any expansion that would occur. So to address this, I worked with the Colville tribe to develop an environmental DNA assay for northern pike. Just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of eDNA or environmental DNA? Yeah, quite a few of you. It's a really effective and efficient tool for determining presence, absence of organisms. And so you just collect a water sample, filter water, and capture the DNA on a little piece of filter paper. Take that back to the lab and ask, was there pike DNA here, right? it's a really simple tool to use and really effective when you're looking for animals at low densities, such as pike at the leading edge of an invasion. So we developed an assay for this, and in 2016 established a monitoring program for Northern Pike in Lake Roosevelt. And this helped inform where suppression efforts could occur and really target the areas where we had really high densities of pike. And over time, this also helped highlight areas where suppression efforts were being effective at reducing those densities of pike. However, simply knowing where pike occur was not the only information we had to address to really tackle this problem efficiently. It was also really important for us to identify the source of invading fish to prevent repeated introductions, because if Northern pike continue to come in, then simply taking them out is not going to solve the problem, right? Like, we want to stop the source of where they're coming in. And this is the question that I'm going to focus on. This was like the big mystery of where fish are coming from. Okay, so to answer this question, we identified Northern pike populations in the region that could potentially be source populations. So the green areas are water bodies where all of these dots are sampling points. The green are the area that's the new invasion in Eastern Washington, and all of the gray are populations that could be potential source populations that were established prior to 2004, with the exception of Lake Oreille, which I mentioned, that one popped up more in 2009, right? All right, so this really boils down to two major river basins. We have the Clark Fork River Basin, which begins in Montana and goes through northern Idaho into eastern Washington. And we also have the Coeur d'Alene River Basin. The headwaters are in Idaho, and that goes downstream. Now, I want to remind you that we have a lot of dams in this area. And now I'm showing you the dams as yellow arrows that are pointing in the downstream direction of water flow. So remember, all of these dams, fish cannot swim upstream. So in order for Northern pike, for example, to get here from the Coeur d'Alene Basin, they would have to go downstream, but then somehow magically impossibly swim upstream. So at the beginning of this project, the prevailing hypothesis was that fish in the Clark Fork River Basin were like zooming downstream and then finding habitat here. And this was really a political hot topic, because everyone in Washington was like, hey, Idaho and Montana, you guys need to manage this was sort of like a debate between the state agencies. You need to manage your Northern pike because they're swimming downstream, they're threatening our native fish. But state agencies are not always just focused on native species conservation. They're also mandated to, in general, they're mandated to manage fish and wildlife for public interest. And pike are really popular sport fish. And so understanding whether or not pike are actually coming from some of these areas is important, because managers may feel pressure from the public to maintain a sport fishery. And also, some of these populations in the Clark Fork River are so well established that removing them would be very difficult and also very expensive. And then when you think politically, it may be difficult for Montana to justify spending all this money of state taxpayer dollars in Montana to solve a problem that's happening in Washington. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it would be difficult to get that funding to go through, right? So we had this sort of contention. And then I just want to remind you too, like, some of us were like, is it really possible that they're just zooming downstream, because that population in Eastern Washington was established in 2004. Why weren't pike in the lake until after that, right? Why would they just zoom through the lake and never stop, even if there's great habitat for them in the lake? So we have two hypotheses here that we were testing. And we use genetic information and tools to address these hypotheses. The first hypothesis is a nearest neighbor hypothesis. And what we're saying here is that if pike are simply swimming downstream from the Clark Fork River, we would expect the populations in those recently invaded areas to be most closely related to the nearest neighboring populations upstream. So in this case, Lake Oreille, but really probably the Clark Fork River. Alternatively, it's possible that fish have been moved around with human transport. We know that's happened in various locations throughout kind of the history of pike showing up in this study area. And if pike had been moved to this area through human transport, then we may not see a clear pattern of relatedness across the landscape. All right, so these are the methods we used. We opportunistically sampled these populations, and those opportunistic opportunities came through annual surveys conducted by state fish and wildlife agencies, as well as suppression efforts that many tribes were conducting throughout the area. And in total, we captured over 450 fish across 18 populations. 5 of those populations were in the recently invaded area of Eastern Washington. We collaborated with folks at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources to analyze microsatellites. That's a type of genetic marker to look at relatedness of Northern Pike. And one thing I just want to highlight here that's cool about this is the reason we collaborated with the Minnesota DNR is that pike are native in Minnesota, and this genetic panel was developed for parentage analysis of native Northern Pike to help with conservation efforts there, but it kind of shows how work can expand kind of beyond those realms of like the first initial focus. And we were able to use this panel to help understand invasion dynamics of invasive Northern Pike outside their native range. We use this genetic information to examine relatedness among the populations. And then we also performed a genetic assignment of individuals in those recently invaded areas back to the source populations. All right, so the first thing I'm going to show you are just some general results. And I'm going to walk you through this table, so don't worry about it. Don't worry about reading everything. The gray areas are established populations that are in Montana or Idaho. And the ones at the bottom are our recently invaded areas. Now, what I want you to pay attention to are the last 2 columns, heterozygosity and allelic richness. These are both metrics that describe the genetic diversity in those populations. They're very similar metrics. The difference between the two, broadly speaking, is that allelic richness is corrected for the number of fish we sample. But in general, in this data set, they were highly correlated, and so both can be used for interpretation here. Now, the other thing to notice is that the heterozygosity and allelic richness, or these measures of genetic diversity, are much lower in those recently invaded populations. Now, this suggests that there's not a constant influx of fish, because if fish were constantly entering this area, we would expect the genetic diversity in the recently invaded areas to be much more similar to some of these established populations. So that's good news, right? If these invasive fish are not constantly swimming into these recently invaded areas, that means that there is the suppression efforts can be helpful at reducing and potentially keeping those numbers really low, and maybe hopefully eradicating Northern Pike from these areas. But this doesn't actually tell us where the source population is, right? And understanding that source is still going to be important for thinking about the future of how are we going to kind of continue to keep these numbers low and make sure that we don't have repeated introductions from whatever source they're coming from. So to do this, we asked how genetically similar are these populations to one another. Now, what I'm going to show you is a principal coordinates analysis. And what this does is it takes all of the genetic information and compresses it down to give each population a set of X and Y coordinates that we can plot on a graph. And when we plot the populations, we can look at how close together they are. That's a metric of how genetically similar they are. Another thing you'll see when I put this up is when I put this graph up are percentages on the X and Y axes, and that is telling us how much of the variation we see on those data points is explained by the genetic information. All right, so this is what we see. You'll notice that between these 2 axes, 50% of the genetic, 50% of where these populations are falling on this graph is explained by genetic information. And so that's actually really powerful. That's like that's pretty good for this type of data. And you'll just have to take my word for it on that point, but I'm telling you it's good. Now, the other thing we're seeing is that all of these recently invaded areas are kind of in their own cloud. They're all closely related. That kind of makes sense because what we believe happened is that the pike showed up in the Oreille River and then spread on their own volition downstream. Now, we were kind of hoping that we would see these populations lumping really closely with one of our source populations. It looks like we see all of those blue dots, the Coeur d'Alene River. Those populations are all closely related, that they probably were the product of expansion and some translocations from a similar source. Same with the Clark Fork River Basin, but we're not seeing how our recently invaded areas are related to those source populations on this graph. There are a few reasons for that, which I'll get into in a minute, but in order to really understand those source populations, we had to ask a different question or use these genetic analyses in a different way. So we then asked the question, could any of these source populations be parents of the fish in the recent invasion? Or another sort of way to ask this question, or more specifically what we asked, is for each individual that we found in this recently invaded area, let's look at its genetic makeup, and then look at the genetic makeup of these source populations and say, okay, could these source populations, could they have spawned an offspring that has the same genotype or has the same genetic makeup as what we see in those recently invaded areas? And what we found was that for 141 of 145 fish that we sampled in those recently invaded areas, the most likely source was cave medicine lakes. These are two lakes that are actually like very close together and essentially one lake in the Coeur d'Alene River Basin. And that tells us that human transport is the most likely cause, right? However, these data still were super interesting and nuanced. We found that although cave and medicine lakes were the most likely source of 141 of 145 fish, some of those fish that had cave and medicine lakes as the most likely source, the probability that cave and medicine lakes could produce that offspring was less than 1%. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's look at these data a little more closely. What I'm showing you here is a heat map that shows the probability, shows those probabilities. Each row is one of the 145 fish that we sampled in those recently invaded areas, and each column is one of the potential source populations. And then each cell is color-coded on the probability that that source population could produce the genotype or the genetic makeup of that particular individual. And so you'll see this is like all of these fish are like super warm, super hot for cave and medicine lakes. And we have some fish like, let's see if I can get the arrow out here. Some of these that are like red hot, right? Like 90% probability the genetic makeup of this fish looks super similar to the fish in cave and medicine lakes. Then we have some other fish down here where it's like, okay, cave medicine lake was the warmest color, but that's like less than 1%. What does that mean? Well, we can interpret this in a number of ways. I should say, there are a number of things that could explain this pattern. First, the fish in these recently invaded areas over time are becoming inbred. Lake Roosevelt is also the furthest downstream, right? The fish in that area have been many generations removed from the source population. They're becoming inbred, and over that process of inbreeding, they're losing genetic diversity, and they don't look as similar as the original fish that came from that source population. Another thing that could explain this is that maybe the true source of fish that were translocated aren't in our data set. Or, and this is kind of what another hypothesis that was supported by the data, is that there may have been multiple sources that contributed, one of which was cave and medicine lakes, and one of which was one that's not in our data set. All right, so conclusions. Overall, we saw there was low genetic diversity in those recently invaded areas, suggesting that we don't have a very strong constant influx of fish. And the results suggest that pike in eastern Washington were introduced illegally by human transport. But the true source population may not be in our data set, or there were multiple source populations, one of which was in our data set, that could have contributed to this invasion. And overall, when we think about management, the really big picture here is that managing people is going to be critical for preventing those repeated introductions, because not only is it illegal, it's bad for the ecosystem, but managers can manage fish. We don't necessarily have training in managing people, right? It's a whole different ballgame. So if you want to know more about like the nitty-gritty details of the analysis, you can find our publication for some more technical details. But a couple things I wanted to highlight. So if you recall, I mentioned that state agencies are required to manage fish and wildlife for public interest, right? And northern pike are really popular sport fish in this area. So this study was taken up by a lot of local papers and magazines, kind of talking about this story. I got some really interesting phone calls from passionate pike anglers who were feeling threatened, feeling that their favorite fishing holes were threatened, and it was really interesting to navigate some of those conversations. But there is, I want to end on a high note, which is that for one, for those folks that like pike fishing in areas where they are not native, don't worry, the pike are not going away forever. They're not going away, period. In all of these locations, you will be able to fish for pike. But in the areas where tribes are overseeing the management in Lake Roosevelt, tribes have been successful at reducing those numbers. And this is really great. And what this is showing us is that over time, each of these columns is a different portion of the reservoir, a different location. They were at the highest densities in the upper portion of the reservoir. That was where they initially invaded, and the tribe, through using the information from both the environmental DNA study and this study, have been able to be really effective at bringing those densities down a lot lower. You can still fish for pike in Montana and Idaho, don't worry. But one thing that's important to notice is that we're not fully eradicating these fish. And there are even instances where the tribe has performed creel surveys. Creel surveys are talking with anglers after they've been fishing. And some anglers are catch and release fishing for northern pike. That's often a conservation strategy that we use for fish that we want to, protect and not eat them all. And what the state of Washington and the tribes are promoting is a full take fishery, right? If you catch a pike, kill it. Because we really don't want them to invade those areas where we have those critical populations of salmon that are a huge economic driver for the area. But we've been successful at reducing those densities, and this is really important because it slows the expansion. Pike are probably going to expand downstream at some point into those areas in the Okanagan and the Methow and downstream, but what slowing this invasion has meant is it's given downstream tribes and agencies a chance to, one, establishing monitoring programs to identify when those pike come downstream and develop a rapid response plan so that they can protect their native fish of conservation and cultural relevance, and also hopefully keep pike populations at low density so they don't have negative effects on those native fish. And so, again, the other really cool thing is that reducing these pike populations has made recent reintroduction efforts of salmon upstream of Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam more likely to be successful. So the tribes, the Colville tribes and several other tribes in the upper Columbia River Basin where dams have extirpated salmon, several tribes have been, with a lot of support from the Biden and Harris administration, been able to pursue some reintroduction efforts and start engaging in cultural activities that are really important to their identities. There's a pretty cool, I put the link up here, a pretty cool video that talks about regionally some reintroductions of Chinook salmon on the Colville and the Coeur d'Alene reservations. So if you'd like to check that out, I put that there. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge this collecting information on all of these pike and all of these populations was a really big team effort with a lot of support from all of the state agencies involved in this discussion, as well as many tribal partners as well, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So it was a really fun project to work on, building that collaboration and communicating across groups. And yeah, it's a fun story to share with you all today. So I'd be happy to take any questions.